entertain you for much more than a minute. Just thank you to all the people we had dinner with last night. I hope the rest of you found somewhere convivial. It's kind of difficult for a surgeon to say this and be taken seriously, but I'm really excited about having an early morning statistics session. And I really am. I've known for a long time that Mary Dixon Woods says there's no such thing as an ugly baby, you know. Everybody's baby is perfect. But I'm aware that Ideal has some weak spots, and I'm aware that there have been for a long time areas where we vaguely make suggestions about how things could be more empirically evaluated with statistical methods that we actually don't know how to do. So I'm just delighted that Deb has taken on this challenge, and she and her group are going to run this session together with a special guest, Rose Baker, who isn't from their group but has been helping me with stats in some very innovative ways for the last couple of years and has a wealth of experience, which I think you're going to hear a little bit about. So Deb, the floor is yours, and thank you very much.
Brilliant, thank you very much, Peter. And I'm very excited that stats is on the agenda. It's great to be able to champion some of the methodology. And I think this will be a plan moving forward. So, future Ideal conferences, we're really keen to get the methodology on the agenda, get some parallel sessions. I'm very aware we're talking about statistics today, but there's other methodologies, mixed method methodologies, and health economists who also need to be part of this group. So I think this is the start of something really exciting. So the session today, we need to keep to time because we have a minute's silence at 11 o'clock, so I am going to be quite strict, hopefully. So we're going to do a little bit about where we've come from, where we're at the minute, and where we're going. And Rose, I think, is going to wake us all up this morning with an exciting talk about the importance of statistics in medicine. And then we've got two NIHR fellows who are going to share what they're currently doing. So Neil from my group, who's a senior statistician and doing a doctoral fellowship, and Sam, who unfortunately can't be here, but has done a pre-recording, who's an NIHR advanced fellow. And then I'm just going to sum up at the end to say we've managed to get some funding and we've got a 5-year plan of some of the methodology in relation to statistical trial methodology, surgical trial methodology. So I'm just going to share quickly what we're planning to do, but I have no answers there yet. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Rose. Thanks, Rose. Just wondering if do the slides, where's Benjamin? Do the slides just automatically come up?
Right, sorry,
Try the other way.
Oh, right.
And again.
Oh, this is the laser point, I think.
Pass forward.
Oh, that's forward.
Is that forward?
How do you use the... Oh,
There
okay,
you go,
right.
you're on.
Thanks. Okay, so I'm going to talk about statistics in medicine, past and present. So the outline of the talk is that I'm going to cover, well, the whole thing's going to be pretty brief, but I'm going to cover the history of advances in evaluating treatments from the medical side and advances from statisticians as well. So it's going to be a rather partial history, I think. And then a current issue, which is the replication crisis in medicine and psychology, and why we have it. And then I'm going to end up saying, is statistics a blessing or a curse? So, as I say, if you really don't like suspense, my conclusion would be that it's mainly a blessing, but not completely. So to avoid anybody having anxiety there. And I've had a checkered career. I said I'm incredibly ancient. Well, I do predate the NHS, although the NHS was being planned before I was. So. And I've got about 100 papers on medical statistics starting in 1980. The first paper was a completely useless thing called the trial of sodium chromoglycate for Crohn's disease, I think. And many of the people I used to know have now turned into buildings. In a sense, I used to know Leslie Turnberg, and now there's a Turnberg building. Right. So, what could be nicer? Stats first thing in the morning, as you say. So, the first clinical trial that I know of is 1747 by James Lind, who was a pioneer of naval hygiene. So it wasn't a big study, 12 men with scurvy. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And that, as you know, vitamin C, citrus fruit, was a good treatment for that. And it only took 40 years for the Navy to adopt it, although it wasn't their fault, actually. So then 1761, of course, still in the 18th century, Thomas Bayes died. So later on, we were going to have Bayes' theorem and Bayesian methods for statistics. 1799, John Haygarth, I think this was a big advance. They had these things called Perkins tractors, which I'd never heard of, for drawing out disease. So this is clearly kind of snake oil and complete hokum. But he tried using wooden tractors and found that he got the same results. So he was very impressed with this and wrote a book called On the Imagination as a Cause and as a Cure of Disorders of the Body. So the placebo effect was firmly established at the end of the 18th century. Then in the 1850s, we have Florence Nightingale and William Farr. I suppose her main contribution was graphing data, really, producing these wonderful graphs. I just don't know why she didn't accept the germ theory of disease, but you know, I suppose you can't have everything. 1870, Galton discovered or invented regression, which of course has been of tremendous use. This should be on the next slide. The FDA was founded in 1906. Now, this scurvy trial, I got sort of fascinated by it. I don't know why really, but this is the description of it from... Oh, I didn't do that, did I? No. This was from Wikipedia, basically. Divided 12 sailors into groups of 2, and they all got some really strange things, I think, like a quart of cider, some sulfuric acid, which is just what you need, you know, and vinegar, seawater. What could be better than that? And in the middle of the trial, they ran out of fruit, so it wasn't the best planned clinical trial ever. But by that time, one sailor was fit for duty and the other had almost recovered. So I've said it's a terrible design and planning, but of course it had a huge impact. Unusual for a clinical trial because you only need one, because people obviously don't recover from scurvy spontaneously, and you only need one sailor to recover to deduce great things. Whereas most clinical trials we do these days, you know, aren't like that. 20th century now, R.A. Fisher, of course, Ronald Fisher, I suppose the greatest statistician ever, wrote Statistical Methods for Research Workers in 1925, and this of course had a colossal impact and led to analysis of variance and designs. Well, agricultural trials, of course, were more complex than clinical trials can be. In 1943, trial of patulin, apparently a common cold drug. Apparently this led to better methods of randomization. I got this from the Psi website. And then in 1946, I gather there was a classic trial with the MRC testing streptomycin for TB. So it was a double-blind trial with good randomization and a classic clinical trial. Then I've got, you know, an interview survey in the USA, tougher drug regulations after thalidomide, although I gather from what I was told yesterday that they weren't tough enough. Or actually we learnt quite a lot about that, didn't we, from you, Joel, I think, about how that worked out. 1965, I've got the Bradford Hill criteria for causation. And I think slightly earlier than that, there was a trial on smoking and cancer with Richard Dole as a survey of GPs. Of course, we've now got things like instrumental variables for looking at causation, which I forgot to put on the slide. That's an important technique which I guess few people know about. You know, for disentangling what causes what. Like, you know, you have people who are sad and obese, but are they obese because they're sad, or are they sad because they're obese? You know, I mean, what causes what? And with instrumental variables, you can try and sort this out. 1972, David Cox introduces Cox regression, so better analysis of survival data. 71, Akaki introduces the Akaki information criterion, so good for statisticians because, you know, better model selection. And Bradley Efron introduces the bootstrap, which gives you better statistical inference. In the 1980s, expert systems, you know, funny things. I remember using one that would diagnose stomach pain, and I answered yes to all the questions and got a very embarrassing diagnosis. And it ended up asking me if I pissed in my boots or something. But I think the expert systems, well, I think they've more or less gone now, haven't they? They've been replaced, I guess, by AI. So modern developments, of course, we've got this thing that we call Markov chain Monte Carlo, which enables Bayesian computing. It's been around since about 1950, but has gradually become more and more popular. And that means you can do Bayesian computations. 1990, the rise of machine learning and artificial intelligence. And current issues there, I think, are explainability. You know, you've got this system that tells you something, but why is it telling you that, you know? And bias. 1993, Breslow introduced generalized linear mixed models, which are a better form of analysis for variance, basically. 1993, the Cochrane collaboration, so evidence-based medicine, firmly on the map with meta-analysis. Now we come up to the modern era with the replication crisis in psychology and medicine, which I want to talk about in a minute. So this is a crisis, really, because a lot of results can't be replicated, it turns out. So without being able to replicate results, where are you, you know? What do you really know if you can't replicate someone's finding? There has been a questioning of the whole methodology, I think, and in 2016, the American Statistical Association issued a rather bland statement about p-values. They're basically okay, but, you know, we shouldn't take them too seriously. So I think now frequentist statistics is moving slightly away from, you know, doing endless hypothesis tests, and we're more interested in modelling data and looking at error bars. But the frequentist Bayesian controversy is still running. So, as I say, it's like National Groundhog Day, because we keep seeming to go back to the same thing over and over and over. But I think everybody now understands that these methods are tools, and we understand their limitations better. I suppose as a surgeon will do, you know, you have all these tools, scalpels and retractors and things, and you know what they can do and what they can't do. Oh, sorry, this is the slide I wanted to be on. This is the replication crisis. This failure to replicate studies goes across all sciences, in fact. And in 2015, they had the reproducibility project, where they found that only 36% of nearly 100 studies in psychology, this was, could be replicated by other workers. So some of these were finding pretty wacky things, you know, like if you show people a lot of large numbers, they will guess a higher number. if you ask them the cost of something, if you've just shown them a lot of big numbers, they will guess a higher number. So some of these things couldn't be substantiated. And it's the same in medicine. There's been a dispute going on about the cause of this. I mean, it does arise from low-powered studies, which in turn arise from the publish or perish culture, questionable research practices, and the obvious thing, of course, is don't do what they call p-hacking, which is to say, well, I've got this data and it's not quite significant, but we shouldn't have Mr. Jones in this study, really, because he doesn't really quite, I don't think he quite fits the criteria. So we'll cross Mr. Jones out, and now we had a P of 0.051, and now it's down to 0.049. Yippee! So that's getting below this magic constant of nature, 0.05. Actually, I think Fisher had a lot of argument about this and what the right value should be for this, and 0.05 is really, completely arbitrary. So we have a perfect storm, really. We've got a lot of underpowered studies which come because people want to publish, they really want to get their work done and publish it, but they haven't got the funds to get enough patients. So we have underpowered studies, and then we have publication bias. So the papers which don't find anything significant often don't get published. So we just see the ones that do find things that are significant, and they overestimate the effect we're looking at. So now go into this in a bit of detail. Most studies are underpowered. This is, I think, from the Cochrane database. These guys who wrote in Significance magazine last December, Van Zwet, Schwab and Greenland, discovered that, most studies in the database are underpowered. And if they do find a significant effect, they were lucky. And the effect that they find will be bigger than it should be, which is what these people have called the winner's curse. So you can see why we have the crisis, because if you find a small effect, it's not significant, you don't get published, and then if you do get published, you've overestimated the effect. So I've been sternly commanded not to give any equations in this talk, because stats first thing in the morning is bad enough anyway, and if you're going to have equations, it's really going to turn people off. So this is a graph anyway, which illustrates what I'm talking about. Okay, that doesn't work. Basically, the purple line is the effect size that you might see for this little study where you have 40 patients and you're measuring something, an effect which has a value of 1 with a standard deviation of 8. So the purple line is the outcome that you might notice for the mean, for this thing you're trying to estimate. And the green line is the significance level. So you see that when you're at the right value, which is 1, which is in the middle, you're not statistically significant. And you only become statistically significant when this green line crosses the blue line, by which time you're estimating this effect as 2. So only the studies here that estimate the effect as 2 or higher would be statistically significant, and they would get published, obviously, and a lot of the others wouldn't. So this is what they call the winner's curse. This is basically, I think, why we have this replication crisis. A lot of underpowered studies, and the ones that do find the effect find too big an effect, and the ones that find a non-significant effect we often don't see. And then, of course, the effect might not be there at all. If it wasn't there at all, one study in 20 should find it significant at 5%. So, of course, when we go back, we can't find anything. So, now I'm concluding. So my concluding slides are, is statistics nowadays a blessing or a curse? So this is rather like asking the local vicar whether you should believe in God or not. So you're not likely to get a negative answer. And so is it a blessing or a curse? So I was going to give this example of insulin shock treatment, which I discussed with some people yesterday. And actually, what happened wasn't quite what I thought happened, because I remembered it as being that they were all happily doing insulin shock treatment until a clinical trial was done which showed that it didn't work. That wasn't in fact the reality. And what happened was more like this Scott parabola that Marika talked about, where initially they thought it was wonderful. 80% of patients were cured, and then doubts crept in, and the thing was regarded as being really quite harmful. And then the clinical trial, in fact, just administered the coup de grace and polished the whole thing off. So by the time the Lancet published the randomized controlled trial that finished it off, it was basically dead anyway. Yes. Oh dear. Yes, let's not mention psychosurgery at all. So one pro was that evidence-based medicine backed up by statistics is surely better than relying on individual judgment and experience. And another pro, of course, is power studies. These are dodgy things because we won't know what numbers to plug into them until we've actually done the study that we're now thinking of doing. But even so, it's better than just guessing, I think. As I say, I did find a surgeon did come to me with wanted to use adrenaline for esophageal varices, that he thought he would get a 10% reduction in mortality, I think it was. And I found he would need 1 million patients. That's really because there isn't much information in yes/no data, He then said, oh, well, I was thinking of 30. So he didn't do the trial, and at least time and money was saved. So I'll conclude on a pessimistic note. I'm glad I did end on a pessimistic note, because this seems to be the feeling of the group, that we're not living in a wonderful world where things are getting better and better and better. So, against statistics, you could say, well, it's just one more thing to take on board for harassed clinicians who didn't actually sign on because they wanted to do complicated mathematics. And being cynical, there is now a kind of obstacle course where you start off by fiddling around with the power study so that the trial seems to be feasible, even though you don't maybe have quite enough patients. And then you go right through to the end of it, where you then go through a process of p-hacking, where you're sort of fiddling around with statistical tests and things to try to get things as significant as possible. And then you end up having to convince the referee of your paper that you've used impeccable statistical methods throughout. So you are basically playing the system. Being very cynical about it. You could say, well, it's just one more system that you've got to play to get your paper published. So I think there were real pressures on the clinicians and academics that lead them into these rather murky practices. Of course, we all want to put the best spin on what we've done, don't we? And it's not much use statisticians saying, oh, you shouldn't do that. So I think, the whole culture needs to change, but I really don't know how it would. So on this cheerful note, I shall end.
That was fantastic, thank you. Such a history as well, and I'm hoping that the next couple of talks will inspire you to feel that we are starting to think about this and change the culture. So I'm really excited to introduce Neil, who's Senior Statistician at the Leeds Surgical Trials Centre, who's going to share his research, his statistical research in learning curves and clustering. Thanks, Neil.
Thanks, Deb. Okay. So yeah, my name is Neil Corrigan, and today I'm talking about trial design to target the conditional average treatment effect, specifically with application to learning effects in clinical trials. So current surgical trial design, it tends to look like this, where we have, it's the conventional RCT, right? We have two procedures that we're randomizing between, and we randomize between them, and we're targeting the average treatment effect, which is it's a single value, like a difference in means or an odds ratio or hazard ratio, which then points us in the direction of which procedure is superior. But of course, in surgery, as we've already heard from lots of other talks, there's always heterogeneity. First of all, there's not just two procedures, there's lots of heterogeneity within each of those arms. But in particular, we often have this issue where we have learning effects. The surgeons are still learning at least one of the interventions during the study. And so you expect that average treatment effect to change depending on how experienced the surgeon is. So here I'm illustrating a situation where if you condition on the surgeon having no previous experience with procedure B, then probably it's going to look like procedure A is more superior at that point. But then as you condition on higher and higher levels of experience, procedure B will start to look better. So you don't have a single average treatment effect. It changes as you condition on different levels of experience. Of course, when you have this, and you're targeting an ATE, the average treatment effect only, the actual result you get in your trial is just going to depend on where are you sampling from on that spectrum. If you get all of your patients from surgeons who are less experienced, your trial is going to end up pointing towards procedure A as looking like it's more superior. And similarly, if you sample a bit more in a balanced way across the spectrum, they may look like there's no difference. If you get all your patients from really experienced surgeons with procedure B, it probably looks like procedure B is better. So this is obviously, it's a problem. You want your AT, or you want whatever you're estimating in your trial to be consistent and be a meaningful quantity. And in current surgical trial methodological literature, there's two schools of thought about how to deal with this issue. I think that both of them slightly mischaracterize the problem in that they take it as a given that the trial design is a conventional parallel group trial and we're targeting the average treatment effect. They take that as a given, and so the problem then becomes about, well, how do we sample our patients so that that ATE is a consistent, meaningful quantity? Like I said, there's two schools of thought. There's the first one, which the approach to heterogeneity in general is just standardize it, treat it as a nuisance and eliminate it from the trial. So with regards to learning effects, that means don't let expert surgeons into the trial, and then you don't have that heterogeneity anymore. It's just a flat curve, and your ATE has this nice, easy interpretation. How does expertly perform procedure B compared to expertly perform procedure A? And you can see it would give you a consistent result no matter how you sampled, because in the restricted space that you're looking at, there is no heterogeneity. So that's fine, it achieves this, making the ATE a meaningful quantity, but of course common criticism of that kind of approach would be that that's fine for proof of concept or for showing efficacy, but not necessarily sufficient for showing effectiveness because you're ignoring a portion of the population, so your results might not be generalizable. Which leads to the second school of thought, which is the pragmatic trial, where you argue that no, this heterogeneity is a valid representation of real practice, we need to capture it, and as long as we capture a representative sample, then everything's fine. So in that approach, you try to capture a representative sample of the spread of experience, for example, and then you get this ATE that represents how does procedure B compare to procedure A on average across the whole population of patients who will be receiving these interventions in practice, which sounds like a better quantity to use for the sake of policy making. However, it's still limited as well. It might struggle to have an impact in practice still because firstly it's oversimplifying the research question just by design. You're taking what is a curve If we take that to be the truth in this example, you're taking that and trying to reduce it to a single point. So whatever answer you get, it's not going to be the right answer in all of the contexts in real practice. And secondly, and probably more importantly, it's also vulnerable to obsolescence. You know, a stage 3 surgical trial, usually by necessity, has to take place before the new intervention has already become widely adopted, because you would have equipoise issues if you waited too long. So you might typically expect at the start of a surgical trial to have a distribution of patients, like that one in row B there, where most patients are being treated by surgeons who haven't used the new procedure before. But that's going to change over the course of the trial, right? Everybody's learning during the trial. Everyone's gaining experience. So even by the end of the trial, it might look different, like the one on row C. And if procedure B then was adopted in wider practice, became the new standard, the distribution would change again. Loads more people would be picking it up. More experienced surgeons eventually would retire. Everyone's learning at different rates. So it would change again, but then that distribution keeps changing over time. It's not a static thing. And therefore the ATE, the true average treatment effect, the thing you're trying to estimate, is changing over time because that distribution is changing over time. So even if your pragmatic trial gets a perfectly representative sample, it's just a snapshot of a moving target. There's no guarantee it's going to be applicable in a year's time. So it's already recognized in the literature that there is value in being able to estimate this curve. Because that's the thing, that stays constant. If you estimated that curve, you wouldn't have this issue of what if you only sampled from here and there. If you had a good estimate of that curve, you'd be able to describe what's going on. And it's already recognized that that's a useful thing to be able to do, and there's already great guidance on how to do that once you get to your analysis, what kind of models you would fit, what kind of data you would need. But there's currently nothing done in the design to ensure that that analysis is robust and sufficiently precise. It's just something you do at the end with whatever data you happened to have collected. So that's what I want to talk about today, trial designs that target the conditional average treatment effect, this curve, rather than just the average treatment effect. Today I'm just looking at a kind of simplified situation. Of course, surgery is a complex intervention. You could consider these same approaches for multiple components of the intervention. For the sake of this talk, I'm considering the treatment to be fully described by the combination of the procedure, the operating surgeon, and their level of experience. But what I'm talking about could be extended. And I'm going to talk about a design which I should preface this by just saying that this design is a theoretical ideal. It's not meant to be, well, it isn't a practically realistic design. It imposes restrictions that we wouldn't be able to impose in practice. But it's still a useful thing to study because it does tell us some things that would be useful in our messier real-life situations, which I'll come back to at the end. So for now, just suspend your disbelief about the practicality of this, and it will end up telling us something useful. So I'm talking about a design here, which I'm going to refer to as the orthogonal design, where you randomize patients between a procedure. I should have said actually, I'm assuming we can randomize between two procedures, but we don't have any control over who the patient's operating surgeon is or how experienced they'll be. We know it, but we don't have any control over it. In particular, we can't randomize it. So we're randomizing between procedures on a one-to-one basis. We stratify that randomization by the combination of surgeon and experience level, so that you have balance between the arms at every one of those combinations. And in this design, you have a number of patients, a sample size n. You split them evenly between a number of surgeons, and then you split those surgeons into equally sized groups, where each group of surgeons covers a different range of experience. And the ranges of experience are located out. It's easier to show in a picture, actually. So this, for example, if every dot there is a patient, that would be the design with 32 patients split evenly over 4 surgeons. The surgeons are all in one group covering the same range of experience, which is located with a lower bound of 2 on that experience measure. And similarly, this would be the 32 patients split evenly across 4 surgeons who have now been split into 2 groups that are covering 2 different distinct ranges of experience. And I mean, there's a number of reasons why this design would be a theoretical ideal. There's also a number of reasons why it would be impractical. Try getting the same number of patients for every single surgeon in your trial. But a really interesting feature about this design is that the precision of the estimator of that curve, the conditional average treatment effect, it depends on all 4 of those design parameters, not just the sample size, not just the number of patients. You know, usually in a conventional trial, we're just focused on the number of patients, but these other parameters are all important too, which I want to show through a toy example. So here I've set up a scenario where in the bottom left I'm keeping track of those 4 design parameters. At the bottom right I've got a graph with surgeon ID on the y-axis and then the level of experience on the x-axis. So you're seeing what range of experience every surgeon is covering. So you can see that in this one, this is a design with 480 patients split across 40 surgeons. The 40 surgeons are in one group, all covering the exact same range of experience. At the top right, I've set up a true conditional average treatment effect, which is the curve. It would be an unbiased estimator from this trial, so the estimator would lie where that line is. And I've shown what the 95% confidence band would look like on this estimator. So you can see with this particular design, it's very precise where all the data is, right in the middle, and it very quickly becomes imprecise as you move away from that point. But if I hold the sample size constant, just change the number of surgeons, then you can see it changes the nature of that confidence band. So same number of patients, but I've just gone from 40 surgeons down to 20. So it's become slightly less precise right in the middle, because it's not as focused as it was. But now, because there are fewer surgeons, each of them have been able to enter more patients, and we see a wider spread of experience within each surgeon. So we have a bit more certainty about what the curve looks like. There's less certainty in the middle, but there's more certainty throughout the whole spectrum. And it's not just about number of surgeons, it's also about where they're located as well. With learning effects like this, with the learning curve, most of the change is going on at the lower end of experience. That's where the gradient is sharper before it starts plateauing. There's more value to be gained from the information there. If I just move these surgeons, shift them to the left, it will change the nature of that confidence band again, where you see you get way more certainty there, but you actually get more certainty across the whole range. It's even, the confidence band's even narrower at this end as well. That's because you're learning a lot more about the curve from that area where there's more changes going on. And again, not changing the sample size in terms of number of patients, it's just about where the data is located. Similarly, going back to this, if I instead just split the surgeons up, so there's still 40 of them, but I'm just going to spread them, then you see again, it changes the nature of that confidence band completely. So there's a lot to be learned here in terms of, it's not all about the sample size, it can just be, you can get good results, more precision in this estimator just from where the data is located. And there's 3 things in particular that will hold for even the messier trials that we tend to run. These 3 things will be beneficial. There are more things that could be beneficial, but they'd be case dependent. But these 3, like without that, if you've got learning effects, they'll be beneficial. And they're things that we can actually aim to achieve in our trials. So it's a balanced procedure assignments within each surgeon by experience class. Something like, so I just wanted to actually point out before I get into that these 3 things are beneficial. Balanced procedure assignments within surgeon by experience class. A large within surgeon spread of experience, so allowing surgeons to enter a number of patients so you see how their particular results change as they gain experience is very valuable. And a large between surgeon spread of experience, like really spreading them out across the spectrum of experience. So you're not only learning what's going on while that gradient is changing, but you're also learning where it plateaus, and you can put the dots together in a way with not a lot of uncertainty. So you can imagine the kind of configurations that give you the best results tend to be where you've got observations at the lower end of experience and at the other extreme. And you can see that confidence band is completely different to the first one that I produced. It's narrow throughout that whole spectrum. And these things they're achievable in our real life trials. So the first one, something like stratification by surgeon by experience. We already tried to do stratification by surgeon. If you've got some experience measure, you can categorize it, say, you can maybe stratify by that. It's not the only way to do it, but something that gives you balance across within each surgeon and across the spectrum of experience will only be beneficial to the precision of this thing. The other one is the large within surgeon spread of experience. It's particularly valuable at the low levels of experience, like I said. And again, while we can't control for any individual patient who their surgeon is or how experienced that surgeon is going to be, we can control what that distribution looks like through our recruitment. So we can through our surgeon recruitment, we can prioritize, for example, as early as possible, the less experienced surgeons get them in, give them time to accrue a number of patients so that you're getting all of that valuable information. And similarly with the large between surgeon spread of experience, again, through our recruitment, through the order in which we recruit surgeons, who we choose to approach first, we can manipulate that distribution to give us more precision in that larger estimator. I was going to talk about a simulation study that how am I doing for time, Deb? Because I'm okay, 15. Okay, so I might have to rush slightly through my simulation study, but so I tried applying this to an actual trial. So going back and looking at the Rolar trial, which it's an exemplar, really. It follows all of the current surgical guidance for how you do a trial. So this was a phase 3 trial. It's got that parallel group design. You're randomizing between 2 procedures, and you're targeting the average treatment effect. And I basically had to go at redesigning this trial, trying to apply these properties to it to see how it could change the precision of the conditional average treatment effect. So I set up this true scenario. So this is if 0.4 is the minimum clinically important difference. This is a scenario where the standard care is better when the surgeon has no previous experience with the experimental treatment, and then that changes, flips in the other direction once you get to experience of about 60 previous operations. And I simulated data that was based on the Rolar population. So you have surgeons with different levels of baseline experience, different caseloads, they're all learning at different rates. And so in my simulated data, I replicated the kind of spread that we saw in Rolar, which I've shown there. And you can see when I simulated the trial design, as per the Rolar design, you got this kind of spread of experience. So it's like what I was showing before, surgeon ID there and the range of experience that they're covering on the x-axis. You get this kind of spread. Most of the data was between 0 and 50 previous operations, and you had a few very experienced surgeons in the trial, and that's the kind of spread that you get. Importantly as well, I've put 2 rows there for each surgeon. So the red dots are the observations in the standard arm, and blue crosses are in the experimental arm. So there are areas within each surgeon where you don't get observations in both arms, so you wouldn't know at that level of experience how they compared. If you compare that to, I don't have time to go into exactly what, but if you compare that to then optimal orthogonal design, which is basically a design where I fixed the sample size at 480 patients, but then I chose a number of surgeons, how to group them and where to put them in order to maximize the precision of that estimator. It comes up with a very different looking design. It's exactly like I was saying earlier, that it wants to spread the surgeons out, it wants to get the information at the lower end of experience, and crucially the treatment assignments are balanced within every level of experience. And what that ends up doing, so under the standard design, this is the kind of result that you end up getting empirically. The estimator is unbiased, so the average, the line in the middle is exactly equal to the true relationship. But that's the 95% confidence band that you get. So under the standard design, you kind of get this, the 80, the average treatment effect was non-significant because all of the data was down at that end. But also when you're trying to examine the learning effects, you get this, sort of borderline significant, not terribly convincing result. If you compare that to the optimal orthogonal design, you get this narrow confidence band throughout the whole thing, and you can see very clearly that there is a significant difference between the treatments at a moderate to high level of experience, which is exactly the data that I simulated, so it's an appropriate result. And again, I didn't have to increase the number of patients to do this, it was just about where the data was located on that spectrum of experience. I also tried this in lots of different scenarios, so simulating with different levels of surgeon effects, different variance components, and so on. And so there were 15 different scenarios in total. And just in summary, you can see if I just flick back between them, that's the standard design, that's under the optimal orthogonal design. It's the same story playing out in every single scenario where you get this narrowing of the confidence band. And so, yeah, as I said, these things, that's like a doubling of the precision, so it's not insubstantial. And it was just through these kinds of trying to apply these properties, a slightly different randomization, a treatment allocation technique, and purposeful recruitment to try to be more purposeful with the spread of experience that we see, so that we get a more precise estimator. Yes, okay, I'll leave it there. I'm happy to take any questions, I guess, at the end, or feel free to come and talk to me about it, or there's my email. But thanks for listening. Thanks for your time.
Yes, I forgot to say, I'm a really bad chair. We're going to do questions at the end just because we need to get the presentations in on time before the 11 o'clock deadline. So our next presentation is from Sam Smith. So Sam is based in the Leeds Institute for Health Sciences. He's a psychologist by training, and he's been awarded an NIHR Advanced Fellowship, and he's looking at the multi-phase optimization strategy. He's not looking at it in surgery, he's looking at it in cancer studies. But I think when you see his presentation, there are elements of it that are, I think, really well aligned with surgical interventions. And so what we're wanting to do in the future is look at this methodology in the surgical space and see how we can utilize it. So I think, how do I press his? You're doing it. I don't need to do anything. Okay. I'm going to hand over to Sam virtually.
Having me. As I'm sure Deb has already said, my name is Sam Smith. I'm based at the University of Leeds, and today I'm going to be talking to you about optimization experiments for complex interventions within the multi-phase optimization strategy. So the MRC has a framework for how we might go about developing and evaluating complex interventions that you might be familiar with. But this group has set out some of the considerations we might need to make when we're designing such interventions. And by complex, what I'm typically referring to here are interventions with potentially interacting components. Now, they have a more complex definition, but for the purposes of this talk, all you need to know is that complex interventions are typically defined as those that have interacting components. Now, these are widely used to address issues of societal importance. And what we traditionally might do, and inspired by the Great British Bake Off, I've used a cake analogy here, is that we might develop a whole package of interventions from our components. So we might put together the flour, milk, eggs, and sugar, and come up with an overall package, and then compare that package against a comparator or usual care scheme. And a multitude of interventions are evaluated this way, and I'm not intending to criticize, because a lot of my own work uses this kind of traditional approach to intervention evaluation. But at the end of a parallel groups randomized control trial, there are often questions that remain, and these are really important critical questions that we've not been able to answer with this kind of trial design. So if we just take an example here, adherence to adjuvant endocrine therapy is a major problem for breast cancer patients, and they may require some additional support to reduce their risk of recurrence and mortality by taking these medications. So here we've got 4 components of a complex intervention, and we might typically evaluate this as a whole package. So these are SMS text message reminders, an information leaflet, a discussion with a psychotherapist to try and reduce some of the distress that patients might experience, and access to advice about how they might self-manage some of their side effects. So if we were to evaluate this within a parallel groups randomized controlled trial, within our findings, we would not be able to know which was the most important component within this intervention package. We also wouldn't know whether all of these components were necessary to support this particular behavior. And we wouldn't know whether a component was good value relative to the contribution of all of the other components. So this kind of discussion, this psychotherapy component might be really expensive. It may well support adherence, but it might not be good value for money relative to something cheaper. So these are fundamental questions that we would typically want to answer within our trials, but we wouldn't be able to do so easily with a parallel groups randomized control trial. Ultimately, what we want to know is what worked, what didn't, and how can we do better next time. So the multi-phase optimization strategy is seeking to address this problem. It outlines 3 phases. The preparation phase and the evaluation phase largely mirror how we might typically design and evaluate complex interventions. However, most advocates for an additional phase known as optimization. So this uses highly efficient experimental designs to build intervention packages prior to definitive evaluation. So we're not removing the definitive evaluation, we are adding an additional phase. So as such, it takes an engineering-inspired approach to intervention development. So you may have seen the resource management principle within the figure that I've just shown you. So most focuses on optimizing interventions using a decision-making perspective. And for this, you need to consider the resource management principle. So what this does is it suggests that we make the most of the resources that we've got available to us and high quality information to help us make decisions about what should form the optimal intervention. And to compare the decision-making priority perspective, which is the most way of thinking, what you might do here is strategically adjust the type 1 and type 2 error rates according to the resources that you have available. And a decision at the end of your optimization trial is needed. It's not acceptable to not be able to make a decision. You must make a decision at the end of your trial. Whereas in a conclusion priority, we typically set alpha at 0.05 at least and power at least at 0.08. And we may have some uncertainty at the end of our trials, and we just have to accept that that is, we are just uncertain in the conclusion priority. But in most, incorrectly excluding an effective component is as important as incorrectly including an ineffective component. So the argument for most is that it helps us to strategically balance effectiveness against affordability, scalability, and efficiency. And in doing so, it increases the likelihood of being implemented should it yield positive results in the evaluation phase. So this is the MRC framework here, and I'm often asked how most fits in with the MRC framework. So just simply, on the left-hand side, we have the development and identification of interventions within the MRC framework. And this largely, I think, aligns with the preparation phase of most. On the right-hand side, we have the evaluation phase. And again, that largely aligns with evaluation phase within most. But centrally here, we have a core element of the MRC framework, which stipulates that we must consider refining our interventions. Now, there's not a great deal of information within the MRC framework about how we might do that. And what I like to think is that most is providing information about how we might go about intervention refinement. So up until now, I've been referring to intervention components and using the word component how we might use in everyday language. But within most, there's a specific definition. And so Linda Collins, who is the brainchild behind most, has defined it as any part of an intervention that can be separated out for study. And what I might add there is that when it's meaningful to do so. So they're the building blocks of an intervention. They can be experimentally manipulated. Our candidate components, so ones that we haven't yet tested, they generally have 2 levels. So this might be set to on or off or higher versus lower. You can have more than 2 levels of an intervention component, but it massively reduces the efficiency of optimization experiments. And the aim of an optimization experiment is to identify the levels of the candidate components that produce the intervention package with the best expected outcome obtainable within key constraints. So here I'll talk about these constraints. So an issue that I see occurring quite frequently at the moment is grant applications and papers using the term optimization without defining what their intended target when their intended target has been optimized. So most recommend specifying a priori what optimization objective you'll use so that you can measure if and when your intervention package has been optimized. Now, the most common used so far is the all active components objective. So here you're designing the most effective intervention package possible, regardless of any constraints like time, money, or other resource. but you may add a key constraint on top of this objective. So you may want to develop the most effective intervention package possible, but if you're working in a busy clinic, perhaps this has to be delivered within a set number of minutes or set number of hours. You might also have financial constraints, so you want to develop the most effective intervention package for a maximum cost of a certain amount per person. So considering key constraints ensures that the optimized intervention, which is later shown to be statistically and clinically effective in the evaluation phase, is more immediately scalable. So I'll show you a brief example of how we're using this in the current trial. And so Rosetta is my NIHR Advanced Fellowship. So I mentioned before the example of adherence to adjuvant endocrine therapy, and those 4 components come from research that my colleague Sophie Green has undertaken for her PhD. And you can read more about the design process of how we went about designing those 4 different components within that link below. And here is our thinking about how these components might operate within a conceptual framework of this particular problem. And most advocates that we should stipulate what our conceptual model is before proceeding to the optimization trial. So working from right to left, we identified medication adherence as a problem that we wanted to address. And then we undertook a process outlined in our paper to decide what factors might affect this particular behavior. So here we've got forgetfulness, and that's being targeted by SMS reminder messages. We've got beliefs about the medications, and we're trying to improve and support people's knowledge about the medication using an information leaflet. We've got psychological distress and flexibility. So people experience high levels of distress after a diagnosis of breast cancer, and this is being addressed through a psychotherapy intervention known as acceptance and commitment therapy. Side effects are also common with these particular medications, so we're providing people with access to a website providing information about how they might self-manage these particular symptoms. So each of these targets is being addressed by an intervention component. We've also stipulated upfront a priori where we might expect to see statistical interactions between these components, and these are illustrated in the dashed arrows that you can see on the left-hand side. So here, as part of the design phase, we had to come up with an optimization objective of our own. So we are attempting to identify the most effective combination of intervention components to support medication adherence in women with early stage breast cancer, but we don't want to exceed a pre-specified cost of £3,397 per patient. And this figure is based on observational evidence for what might be cost effective within this particular clinical context. So I'm going to show you the design that we're using for Rosetta. So this is a 2 to the 4 factorial design as it will test 4 intervention components. So everyone here will receive usual care, and you'll see 16 conditions, and every one of these conditions will receive usual care. So instead of randomizing people to 2 groups, as you might see in a parallel groups randomized controlled trial, here we're randomizing people to one of 16 conditions. So you see here the first intervention component. So this is illustrated such that half of the women allocated to the conditions will receive the SMS messages, and half of them will not. So conditions 1 to 8 receive the messages, and 9 to 16 do not. Moving forward to the information leaflet, again, half receive the leaflet and half do not, but this is carefully counterbalanced against the previous component. Moving forward to the ACT intervention, this psychotherapy intervention, again, half of the women will receive this component and half of them will not, but this is carefully balanced against the previous 2 components. As you probably guessed, the website comes next. Half will receive this and half will not. So you can see the overall sample size is still large, but only 32 women will be allocated to each of these particular conditions. And over these 16 conditions constitutes each of the unique combinations of these 4 components. So for those of you who are starting to be concerned about statistical power, this slide is for you. So addressing suitable research questions using a balanced factorial experimental design often requires fewer participants. So if we were to attempt to answer the questions around what were the main effects of our interventions, each of these 4 different interventions, we would need 4 individual randomized controlled trials, which would require 1,400 women to take part, or 350 per trial. And you wouldn't be able to look at any of the statistical interactions within these trials. You could do a large single trial, so you could do a 5-arm randomized controlled trial, which would need far fewer women. You'd need 875. But again, you wouldn't be able to look at any of the interactions. Within the complete factorial that I've just shown you would need 352 women allocated across 16 conditions. And the beauty of this design is that you'll be able to estimate all of the main effects of your intervention components, all of the 2-way interactions, the 3-way and the 4-way interactions with identical power. So despite there being an additional phase that we're advocating for here, the most approach may lead to faster scientific progress in the long term. And I'd urge you to have a look at this simulation paper produced by Linda Collins and colleagues, published in 2009 in Clinical Trials, for more information on how we might lead to faster scientific progress using the most approach. So in summary, MOST is an innovative framework that advocates for intervention optimization to improve intervention ease, so effectiveness, affordability, scalability, and efficiency. Optimization experiments can be a highly efficient way of addressing important research questions, but we're not advocating for the removal of a parallel group's randomized controlled trial. These optimization experiments are done prior to the definitive trial. There's a wide range of experimental designs to consider. So I've talked to you today about factorial designs, but there are also fractional factorials, smart trials, and a whole range of others. So please do stay in touch if these kind of experimental designs are of interest for you. There are methodological and delivery challenges, but we're working on solutions. Each time we do one of these trials, we come up with more solutions. So I'd urge you to do stay in touch if you're interested in this. We are running a CPD course in Leeds towards the end of next year, so please do drop me an email if this is something that might be of interest to you.
So I hope you can see from, it's obviously a very different example, but I hope you can see that the component part aspect of MOST feels as if it could align itself quite well with surgical trials. And also those component parts don't necessarily need to be simultaneous. So some of the MOST designs are looking at sequential component parts. So if you think about surgery being about pre-surgical safety and care, and then surgical interventions, and then post-operative care, actually there's a sequential aspect to some of those component parts in our research. So I think this, I'm hoping that we'll be able to look at this in our surgical trials. So I'm just going to finish off the session before we go to a little bit of time for questions, to share what I'm hoping that we're going to look at over the next 5 years. So I'm a statistician by training. I'm based at the Leeds Surgical Trials Centre, working with David Jane, who's our clinical lead. And I've just been awarded an NIHR research professor, which is fantastic. And the methodology is around statistical methods for surgical trials. So that's fantastic, because it means that we can fund research in this space over the coming years and help support the underpinning of the statistical design of surgical trials that was alluded to earlier. So you all know this, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time doing the background, but we know that 1 in 3 hospital admissions in the NHS in the UK involve surgical care. So a lot of interventions that are happening in our NHS environment involve surgery. But we know on the back of this that very clearly unlike drug trials, that surgical innovations are introduced into practice without necessarily that robust evidence. And the reason that this happens is this, are the speakers all right? Can you hear me okay? Yeah, just, you can hear me? It's okay. I'll just keep going. And the reason for this, as everybody knows, is that surgical trials are complex. Not only the interventions that are complex, but the design of a large phase 3 randomized trial is a long, drawn-out process. To get the funding for that trial is difficult, and the delivery is even harder, and they can take quite a long time. And so it's no surprise that in terms of the medical research budget, there's less than 5% of the budget that's spent on surgical intervention research, and less than 5% of the current NIHR portfolio is researching in this space. And this is evidenced in the literature when, so this is a paper that was published last year, which did a systematic review looking back over the last 12 years in surgical journals and high-impact clinical journals, and identified almost 400 randomized controlled trials, concluding that improvements in the design, implementation and reporting of these RCTs in surgery were warranted. And I've picked out a couple of real key areas here. So if you look at the treatment effect, you can see the estimated relative treatment effect is quite large. That then keeps your sample size down low, so you can see that the final sample sizes are quite small, 122 patients. Is this because I'm too close to the microphone? No? Okay, I'll just keep going. You can see that almost 80% of these trials didn't control for surgical experience, and as we've heard from Neil, that can have an impact on the final conclusions. Almost all of the studies didn't monitor the intervention, and when a bias assessment was conducted, you can see that almost 3/4 of the studies had at least some concerns around bias. So this situation cannot continue. We have to do better, because this can have an impact on patient safety and future patient planning. So we've heard a lot about the MRC complex intervention framework, and we know that surgical interventions are complex interventions. I think they're specific complex interventions. First of all, I think the environment that we conduct surgical trials is maybe less well developed as the environment for drug trials. So the infrastructures that we work with in terms of our sites is often less well understood, and the regulatory process is often less well understood. So that's quite complex to navigate with new research teams. I think understanding the level of evidence we need to be able to provide the surgical community to change practice, and understanding behaviour change on the back of producing evidence from trials is really important. We can design the best study in the world, we can fund it, we can deliver it, we can get a New England Journal of Medicine paper. It may not change practice because there may be a lack of understanding about what is needed to show the surgical community to change that practice. So I think, you know, they are difficult, as well as the things we've heard about in terms of the component parts, the multifactorial structures and the clustering. So, as you all know, and the reason we're here today is that the IDEAL framework was set up on the back of the MRC complex intervention framework to highlighting the need to look at this specifically for surgical interventions. And just last year, it was reported by the Department of Health and Social Care Strategy that the single most important way to improve healthcare is through increasing use of innovative research designs. And this is championed by the IDEAL collaboration. It's also championed by, here in England, the Royal College of Surgeons of England, who've set up the surgical trial centres. We now have surgical trial centres across the country working to champion this improved quality. But I'm a statistician, and what's become really obvious to me is that there is no aligned statistical framework that sits alongside IDEAL for the statistical underpinning of study designs when you walk through that research pathway and through those different IDEAL stages. And I think this is a gap, and I think it's something that we can address. So we've got some funding from the UK CRC Trials Unit Network to do some reviews of what people are currently doing, as well as reviewing some of the appropriate methods that we could use to try and pull the groups together, first of all across the surgical trial centres and then across the Trials Unit Network, to be able to come to some consensus about what some of these methods may work, what methods need researching a bit further, and try and just start that discussion. We've also got the funding through my research professorship, which gives us 5 years of funding to try and start looking at some of these methods and applying them, maybe to some retrospective data from the surgical trial centres, and potentially prospectively in funding applications. And there's 3 work packages in relation to that. First of all, looking at the existing evidence around early phase designs that are used in drug trials, which are not used currently in the surgical trial setting. The second work package looking at these optimization strategy designs, which Sam's just spoken about. And the third workshop is what I spoke about in IDEAL last year at the virtual meeting around the role of virtual patient data in silico clinical trials. I'm not going to talk about 2 and 3 today because they've been covered previously. So I'm just going to focus for 10 minutes around the early phase area. So we know that we've got our 2A and 2B areas of the framework which would classify as kind of earlier phase research. And when you dig down into the methods that are suggested for conducting IDEAL 2 studies, you can see how they're classed as prospective development studies and possibly feasibility RCTs. And my question is around how we define feasibility. And if you look back at the NIHR, we're trying to encourage NIHR to work with the IDEAL group. The definition for NIHR of feasibility is whether something can be done. So that might be about whether we can deliver the intervention, whether we can collect the data, whether we can recruit patients. But it's not necessarily about activity. And if you look at the drug scenario, so this is a paper from 2011, which was a systematic review and provided guidance around how to identify a phase 2 trial design. You can see, I don't think the pointer's working, but you can see we've got various outcomes of interest in column 3, which is around activity and toxicity, not just feasibility and deliverability, but actually levels of activity. And you can see that the randomization, which is in section 5, can be single-arm studies as well as randomized studies. Those randomized studies may include a control, but they may not include a control. And you can see that the design categories also highlight 1-stage designs, 2-stage designs, multi-stage designs, down to the bottom of seamless phase 2, phase 3 designs. So the opportunity from the drug literature is actually quite vast. But when I've looked at some of the literature, some of these designs are not being considered in surgery. And I think we could maybe look at these and maybe understand why if they don't work, or maybe consider using them if they could work. So I just want to go through a couple. I've just pulled out a couple of these designs that have been suggested, and I've pulled out the ones that I've got experience in. So I used to work for Cancer Research UK, working in early phase drug trials, and these are some of the methods that I used to use, and this is why it's sort of in the forefront of my mind. So this is a single-arm, single-stage design that was put forward from Fleming in 1982 and was adapted by the MRC by Roger Ahern in 2001. And these designs are still being used in drug trials. And these assume that you have knowledge of a current kind of benchmark around a response rate. So if you've got existing treatments and you know generally what the current response rate, bearing in mind we're talking about drugs, not surgery, what the current response would be, then you might design an early phase single-arm study, which is looking at a brand new treatment to make sure that the response rate is no less than what you would currently see. And if you hit that boundary and that benchmark, maybe you're interested in taking that drug forward. So what we have to do statistically, so there are statistical underpinnings to these designs, and the statistical underpinning is around identifying upfront that threshold that you need to cross. So if you think about this is the true response to treatment ranging from 0 to 100%. We might know that our current standard of care we achieve on average maybe theta A as a benchmark. So we know our new treatment has to be at least theta A or potentially higher than that. So we would maybe specify our new treatment needs to hit a threshold of maybe theta B. And if we see anything less than theta A, that treatment doesn't warrant further investigation in phase 3 studies or randomized phase 2 studies. If we hit theta B, that treatment moves forward into the next phase quite quickly. And there's statistical underpinning for these designs, which is important. This single stage design has been extended by Simon into Simon's two-stage design. That was in 1989. And then it was adapted again by Bryant and Day in 1985 to look at also activity and toxicity. So you can see by the top graph here, the table, the top right-hand cell of that table identifies a drug which has hit the threshold for response and has also hit the threshold for toxicity. So it's not too toxic, and we're seeing some activity that we're interested in. And using that information, that might be a planned interim analysis that we then say, we're happy to go on to a second stage, and we use that information from that first stage to design how many patients more we need to see in the second stage to be able to make a decision about whether we should take this drug forward into phase 3 studies. So this is a slightly different design. You can see there's a two-stage approach. We use the first information to design the second stage, but also we can adapt it to look at multiple outcomes. So I guess the question in a surgical space is, what would response look like? This is a very binary, well-understood outcome measure in cancer trials. So what would our response be? And we don't want this to be long-term clinical effectiveness or, long-term clinical outcomes. We want quick decisions to be able to move through the research pathway quickly. So this is what needs quite a lot of thought, I think. It could be some component of surgical success. It might be some mechanistic, depending on what your surgical intervention is aiming to do. Maybe there's some mechanistic outcome that we could use. And the question on the back of these single-arm studies is, what happens if response is greater than the benchmark? But actually that's down to the patient population rather than the actual intervention itself. So that leads us into our randomized phase 2 trials. So this is a situation where we've got eligible patients and they may be randomized to our current standard of care or a new, given I'm taking this from the drug trials, I'm going to talk about drugs, to a new drug. And in this situation, the right-hand side is the same as the previous examples, where we will give patients the new drug, we'll estimate the response rate. But what we have in this scenario is, rather than assuming a particular benchmark, we randomise patients to the standard of care, so we've got a true estimate of that benchmark. Now, first of all, you might think, well, this just looks like a phase 3 trial. The biggest difference between this design and a phase 3 trial is that we're not powering that direct comparison between our standard of care. We're using the randomized control arm to make sure that our benchmark is correct. So in that way, you don't necessarily always need exactly the same number of patients if you're just trying to evidence your benchmark. So you might actually implement a randomization which is a 2-to-1 randomization in favor of the intervention, because your control arm are just there to give you that benchmark. They're not a direct comparator. So this is just to summarize that the aim of a phase 2 trial, a randomized phase 2 trial, which looks a little bit like a phase 3 trial, is not to test the hypothesis of equality of interventions across the groups, but it is to select the most efficacious intervention with a very high probability, and that's where the statistical designs come in. So a randomized phase 2 trial is not designed statistically to compare the group, and hence it doesn't require phase 3 hypothesis-driven sample sizes. It is designed with predefined criteria, and it does require a statistical design, but using some of these early phase methodologies. So in that randomized phase 2 study, you could use a Fleming-Ahern design to estimate how many patients you would need in your intervention arm, and you might do a 2-to-1 randomization to make sure that you get the benchmark right. So the key difference is using early phase methodology, and using early phase methodology brings the number of patients down because we're not powering a direct comparison. And then I guess the next one of the other designs that was put forward in the 2011 guidance was looking at the adaptive phase 2, seamless phase 2, phase 3 studies. So generally, when we conduct standalone studies, we have a randomized phase 2, which may be our learning phase, where at the end of that study, we'll stop recruiting, we'll make a decision about whether there's enough evidence to warrant moving through that research pathway into a phase 3 trial. And then we'd start our phase 3 trial, and we might and we'll then recruit more patients, and we'll probably have a different outcome measure. So in this top scenario, we've often got the outcome measure for our randomized phase 2 as some kind of mechanistic or early stage surrogate outcome, and then we'd hit the mark, we'd move into phase 3, and the outcome measure for our confirmatory study would be that longer term clinical outcome. We can collapse these down using the methodology that we have, using the randomized phase 2 methodology, to then have an interim decision point and make a decision about whether we want to move forward or not, but moving forward, ticking the box and continuing to recruit. And the obvious advantage here is that we're using our randomized phase 2 patients in our randomized phase 3 analysis, and hence the time of the study is shorter and the number of patients that we're recruiting into our study is shorter, and we get answers more quickly. So there's two different ways that you could do these seamless trials. You could design your randomized phase 2 using that surrogate measure, and then you could tick that box for mechanistic, seeing the mechanism of action that you want to see and move into the phase 3 of the clinical outcome. Or there's an alternative approach where you specify what your clinical outcome is up front, and you do a planned interim analysis of that clinical outcome. And these are called group sequential designs, where we have planned interim analyses of a longer term clinical outcome. The advantage of these is that it allows premature termination at interim analysis if we're not seeing a level of activity that we would expect to see, and we set a priori stopping rules based on superiority or futility. So I think what I've tried to summarise very quickly is that there are lots of designs out there from the early phase setting in drug trials, and I see these very rarely in the surgical space. And I don't know whether that's because they just won't work. I don't know whether that's because people aren't aware of them. I don't know whether there's a nervousness about trying to translate them into the surgical space. But I think as we're starting to think about underpinning IDEAL with statistical guidance, we need to think about some of these designs and come up with some solutions and recommendations. So I've focused a bit today about the early phase design. So IDEAL 2 is feasibility, and feasibility can always be an outcome, but we could also consider these as smaller screening studies. The aim is very different. We're looking to see whether a new intervention is good enough to move forward in the research pathway, not to make a direct comparison. And so the statistical aim is identifying with high probability something that's got a response level or an activity level that's worthy of further investigation. I think IDEAL 2A could be designed as single stage or two stage, but single arm studies, and we shouldn't discount those. That obviously has a big impact on the number of patients. They can be randomized, but they don't always need to be a one-to-one randomization. We should think about that. And we should think about the use of shorter-term surrogate outcomes and how we define those, and maybe there's some work about how we define those in the shorter term and what their correlation is with the longer-term outcomes. I think in 2B, this will always be a randomized study. Again, there's a decision about whether you have a planned interim analysis on clinical outcomes or whether you use those surrogate outcomes, whether it's a standalone study or whether it's a seamless study. And then the two other work packages that we'll be doing are looking at the MOST design, which I'm not going to talk about because Sam's talked about that. And I've just got one slide about what we're hoping to do with the in silico space, which is looking at simulated data, and looking at simulated data not only in the late stage, but looking at simulated data in the early stages of interventions, and whether this can help us understand better why maybe some interventions fail and why they don't pull through, but also looking at the efficiencies that can bring. This makes me a little bit nervous, I have to say. But you know, this is an area that's moving forward, and we should be looking at this and adopting these new methods and working out whether there's space for them in our research pathways. So my last slide is the aims over the next 5 years are that we've got a bright future, that we've got 3 targeted areas looking at improving the quality of surgical trials. We want to embed some of these existing methods, but also develop some of those methods and look at new novel methods to create a very streamlined pathway through to clinical changing clinical outcomes. And I think what's important for me as a statistician is bringing the community together. We don't speak as methodologists as much as we should. And so the platform that we've got with the Royal College of Surgeons and with the IDEAL group in bringing methodologists together and trying to tackle some of these opportunities and challenges, I think is really positive. And I'm really grateful for Peter for putting methodology on the agenda with IDEAL. And I think I'm going to stop there. Yeah, I'm going to stop there. Okay. So we've got 2 minutes before we have to do our minute silence, before we want to do our minute silence, not have to. I guess, yes.
So I have a question to Neil.
Neil, do you want to come up with the microphone?
Would you like me to use the microphone?
I think Ben's got a microphone. Ben, if we have a minute's silence and there's still questions, could we eat into a couple of minutes of coffee if there's questions? Okay.
Neil, thank you very much for your presentation. I really enjoyed this. So I'm a gynecological oncologist and I do surgical investigator-initiated clinical trials. What intrigued me was how you integrated surgical experience in the thing, and this is an actual issue that I need to solve.
Yeah.
At the moment, I solve it by selecting a highly experienced surgeon through a ruthless accreditation program that makes me enemies, which is fine. But you seem to suggest that there is a way to include lesser experienced surgeons as well. My understanding is that that move will drive the number of research participants or patients up. Is that so?
Excuse me, we've reached your minute. Shall we have it now? I will give you some time to think as well.
So to answer your question, I think it would certainly increase the pool of patients that you can be recruiting into the study. Because what typically tends to happen at the moment is we'll set a lower band for the level of experience the surgeon needs to have before they can be randomizing patients. And during that time, you'll start the study. Surgeons will be picking up the intervention for the first time, and they'll be doing their kind of learning cases in practice, but you're just ignoring them for the trial because you're trying to eliminate the heterogeneity from the trial, so you're not using them in your analysis. Whereas it would be much better if you could actually they're doing it anyway, why not capture it in the trial and use the information to learn about the learning effects?
No, I have two questions. One for you, Neil. What about randomization, allocation, concealment, if you do it the way you suggest? Would there be... Well, I'm a bit worried. If you do it per surgeon and per experience, then as a clinician or as a researcher, I might know what the next patient will be allocated to, so my concealment might be gone.
Yeah, no. So I think if you stratify by a very, very small window of experience and within each surgeon, it's going to be too predictable. So yeah, there are papers about different ways of balancing the allocation and measuring the predictability of it. So it wouldn't be as simple as just saying stratify by number of operations, because then it would be deterministic. You'd go standard care experimental and it would be completely predictable. But there are ways like biased coin methods or things that they won't give you a perfect balance, but they'll maintain a balance between treatment allocation balance and non-predictability.
But then you need to broaden up a bit, because then you can use a permuter block or whatever, but then it's not that small, and then absolutely. Might influence your confidence intervals again.
Yeah. So it won't be perfect. It needs to be broad enough to not be predictable, but it would still be better than doing nothing like we do.
I agree. Can I ask another question? It was for Sam. I'm not sure. Is any?
I'll try. I'm trying to understand most.
Because in the factorial design, if you have interaction for pharmaceuticals, we often don't want that. Here, well, at least in the example he given, you might be interested of. Do you calculate then how large the interaction is and how large the effect of the interaction and what is best in combination? And do you do that then on an additive or a relative scale?
So there's the full factorial, and then there's fractional factorials as well, where you can identify the interactions that you're wanting to evidence, because not all interactions you'll need to look at. So yes, the power for the interaction is often quite small, but I think balancing out the number of interactions you want to look at and identifying those up front and designing around those. So it's the analysis is around the fixed effects, predominantly, but the interaction terms are pre-specified up front, and that then influences the sample size.
But then if you go back to the clinician, it will be hard, because there will be a relative additive effect, whereas you might be interested in an absolute additive effect to go back to the patients. Yeah. Something we need to think about, yeah.
Neil, I was fascinated by the confidence intervals graphs. The solutions that you were suggesting optimized bothered me on a couple of levels. First of all, I assume that the pragmatic sort of surgical view that says, oh, well, that looks like a nice graph with narrow confidence intervals. The only trouble with it is that it includes all the absolute beginners. So if we just take out those people, does that send the confidence intervals way up again?
No, so it certainly would change them, but so I think there has to be a balance. What I'm not suggesting doing is immediately getting all the least experienced surgeons you can find and just running with the trial, because obviously...
It did sound a bit like that.
Yeah, but so to be clear, obviously you need a level of quality assurance and minimum levels of safety. But what I am suggesting is to try to include lesser experienced surgeons as early as reasonably possible within those constraints of quality assurance, etc., because you do get a lot of value from the information there. So it doesn't necessarily have to be from absolute zero, but from as low as reasonably possible, because that's where all of the change is happening. So right. Statistically, it's where there's a lot of value.
Okay, that still gives us a tough and fuzzy decision to make about, what's an acceptable baseline. There's also a very important ethical perspective to this. I think in the future, surgical learning curves are a scandal in the making. I think it's one of these things that we accept because it's always been that way, but which, if presented to the public in the wrong way by the media, could look horrendous. That we know that we're causing harm, and we've known for years, and we continue to do it, and we just accept it as the surgical learning curve, because that's how you measure it. So I think it's very important to be cognizant about that when we talk about allowing people who haven't actually mastered the technique to get into trials and randomized patients. And clearly I would advocate for trying to get everybody up to as high a level as possible, which I'd rather spoils a lot of the point behind your work.
But so in response to that, I'd say that of course, that would be the ideal. If surgeons could learn without treating a patient, they could learn elsewhere and then be proficient from patient number one.
Yeah, and I agree that also, the part of the solution to this is to start adopting a grown-up method of credentialing surgeons for new techniques, where they get proctoring, they get supervised experience, they get simulation, and they don't get to fly the plane on their own until they've been through all that and achieved reasonable results on the parameters we measure.
And I, oh sorry, Neil.
So just a couple of things in response to that. So initially, so these methods of making sure you've got a precise estimate of that curve, they could also be applied to figuring out at what point do you hit proficiency. Because at the moment, like I said, when we run the trials, the surgeons, they will be learning on people. That's just happening outside of the trial. So for now, while that's happening, we should be capturing it in the trial and learning from it, which was my point in the presentation. But also, let's say in the future, we find a way that surgeons, they can learn without treating patients and then they're immediately proficient. Yeah, that specific example that I presented there, we don't need to learn about that anymore, but those ideas I think can be applied to any treatment component. So operating surgeon experience is one example, but any other component that you can't randomize, it will be the same principle. You want to see a good spread of variance in the trial so that you can learn about it.
And I think this is where all the virtual reality training is now coming in. I think this is really important, because if we can shorten that learning curve as best we can, then that's a really positive thing, not just from a patient's perspective, but also a surgical perspective. I do think patients understand the learning. You know, I sit on a funding committee, so on the funding committees that we have with the patients who are involved in those funding committees, they get it. So is it some of this about communication as well? Because there's not a concern from them, but because they accept that, you know, surgeons have to go through this training to become experts. But there is a little bit about communication as well. But yeah, anyway, I think we need to.
Right, we have to look as if we care, as well as actually care.
Yeah. So I think I'm gonna have to stop it there and continue discussion over coffee. Is that right? Yeah, because Ben's going ballistic at the back. We've overrun. Thank you everyone for your attention this morning, because I know statistics first thing on a Friday is not necessarily. So thank you.